All right, here we are, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Henrik with Red Eyes TV. And of course, check out our websites if you're new, redeyes.tv and redeyesemembers.com for some of that extra members content, exclusive stuff just for our members. We appreciate you if you're joining us live or maybe tuning in later on in the archives over at Odyssey or BitChute, Rumble, VK. We go out on a number of places. I know we have people joining us over on Telegram as well. So we appreciate you wherever you tuning in from. But yes, so today a very, very important show. We've talked about the COVID thing here now for, the 2 years at least, trying to get to the bottom of this. What are we looking at? What is it? Is it a bioweapon? Was it accidentally released? Is it naturally made? Is it a chimeric virus? And of course, at this point, we lean towards the latter here. We're looking at something which was quite intentional, in fact. That's what it's looking like. But we're going to dive into this more here in detail today with our guest, none other than Ron Unz from the Unz Review, actually, but it's unzreview.com if you want to visit the website. And of course, Ron has been, he has a great site. It's a lot of, truly, in the sense, diverse range of columnists that Ron has, from Andrew Anglin to Michelle Malkin, to Kevin Barrett of Truth Jihad and so forth. A lot of people over there. But Ron, thank you so much for coming on today. It's good to have you here.
Hey, great to be here.
Excellent. We appreciate you. And before we get into the details here, now I know you have an outline here, right, in terms of like where this thing comes from, what we're looking at. And I want to dive deep into this with you. But before, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind, and when you started Unz Review and kind of what motivated you to do that.
Sure. Well, my original background was as a theoretical physicist, but I got involved in financial services software, I guess about 35 years ago. And then afterwards, by about the early to mid 1990s, I became much more heavily involved in politics, political issues and that sort of thing, including running some campaigns in California and other parts of the country. And public policy has been something I've always been very strongly interested in from the time really I was in college. And probably around during the 1990s and then afterwards, after a break in the mid to early 2000s, I ended up becoming much more actively involved in writing on public policy issues. For a number of years, I was the main funder and actually the publisher of the American Conservative, a small public policy opinion magazine. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I ended up actually starting the Unz Review, which I viewed as sort of a reasonable way to provide a convenient access to a wide range of different alternative media outlets and alternative writers, both from the left, from the right, from other ideological perspectives like libertarianism or that sort of thing, and just mixing them all together. Because generally, most websites on the internet, most webzines, or most print publications tend to have a skew in one way or another way. And I think there's sometimes some useful aspects to putting all these people together, because sometimes they actually tend to agree on certain ways that you wouldn't really expect, given the fact that they're perceived as being from different ideological camps. And also, one reason I decided it would be useful to put that together was to provide a platform for my own writings. I'd actually started to do quite a lot of writing myself around partly in the 1990s, and then more recently around 2010, 2011, 2012. And since my articles tend to be much longer and less frequent, having a platform where all these other writers would produce much more regular content would just provide me an outlet for my own writings when I ended up getting around to doing it. And so it's really been the last 3 or 4 years that I became much more actively involved in doing writing. And there's especially one long series I put together, what I call the American Pravda series, which really focuses on many aspects of the events of the last 100 years, where much of really what we know from our standard history books or from the news media is actually much less accurate when you go back and look at the underlying primary sources, the facts involved. And that actually relates to a project that really had occupied a lot of my time in the early 2000s. And that was the idea of digitizing and making available the complete archives of hundreds of America's leading opinion magazines from the last 150 years. You have some that are still around, like The Nation and The New Republic and Harper's, but also many other publications that at the time were extremely influential and important, like, for example, Century Magazine or The Forum or Saturday Review or The Reporter, but vanished years ago, so people aren't even aware of them right now. But at the time, they were just as significant as The Nation or The New Republic or sometimes even The New York Times. And when you go back and read those publications, talking about the events of that era, you really find that the perspectives they have are very different from that of more recent history books or the news media. So, in a sense, it's a question of like revisiting a lot of these past events. So when you find out that so much of what we know about the past is really mistaken, it gives you much more perspective of believing whether or not you should believe everything you find in the news media today.
It's true. It's changed radically, I'd say, the last even 5 to 6, 7 years, an acceleration of that. But this really began in, I'd say, 80s, 90s, and then it took off in the 2000s, I'd say. But a complete revisionist world, really, that we live in now. So getting that perspective and going, way back in the written word and so forth is very important to see what they were thinking and what was acceptable even at that point, right? Because now we've been gridlocked and in a sense choked off from even looking at certain topics or asking certain questions because they've been deemed to be, outlawed essentially and forbidden by the establishment,
Exactly.
Very good. So interesting. So under this American Pravda, of course, you have this series on major COVID biowarfare articles. This is a lengthy one, and you describe it early on here. Since April 2020, I've published a long series of articles arguing that the COVID outbreak was due to an American biowarfare attack against China and Iran, and have been almost uniquely publicly talking. I've been almost uniquely publicly talking about this extremely controversial position. I've also placed it within the context of the hidden history of America's long-standing biological warfare program. That's a lot of people actually don't know that not only America, but many countries, but America has been on the forefront of this, of actually doing tests on their own population. I think if it ever comes up in the mainstream media, it's something like the Tuskegee experiment, because then you have, kind of one of the victim classes being lifted out and so forth. But they've, all kinds of things, dropping bacteria inside of light bulbs in the New York subway, like very strange things, right, that they've been experimenting on. But so lead us into this and lay the kind of the foundation for this discussion and this argument here, if you will, Ron.
Sure. Well, what really happened was when the COVID outbreak first began in China, it started getting into the press towards the middle of January. There were this report of mysterious viral epidemic taking place in China. At the time, nobody really knew how serious it was. And, some of the circumstances seemed strange to me. I didn't really pay a tremendous amount of attention at the time, but by about the end of January, a number of developments took place that made me start to really wonder whether there was more to the picture than the media was presenting. And, when you really look at it, the outbreak in China took place right at the peak of America's international confrontation with China, obviously under the Trump administration. In a sense, we're talking about a situation where we have a country whose economy probably had surpassed that of the United States by most measures about 6 or 7 years ago. A very large country, the most populous country in the world. And America was in an international confrontation with that country, primarily over trade issues, but, over broader issues as well. And a viral epidemic like that suddenly breaking out seems like a strange thing. Now, the media obviously presented it as obviously being a natural outbreak, and most people probably thought it was, and I certainly thought it certainly might be. But as I started looking into it a little bit more, the edges of the internet started coming up with facts that really neither I had been aware of nor probably most other people. For example, and some of this came from very obscure sources like fringe bloggers, Westerners who were living as fringe bloggers in China, other people whose work was being published nowhere at all. To give you an example, this was not the first viral outbreak that was taking place in China. In 2018, there was suddenly a mysterious viral outbreak that devastated China's poultry industry, one of its main food sources. It appeared out of nowhere, and it got some attention in the American media, but only a little bit of attention. Then in 2019, there was a massive outbreak of a swine flu epidemic that destroyed 40% of China's pig herds, a pork industry, the largest in the world. And so, we're talking about something basically, we have these mysterious viral outbreaks that have taken place previously in China in 2018 and 2019. And then suddenly, right at the end of 2019 and getting into the new year, a viral epidemic suddenly appears that hits China's population as well as simply its food supply. So things like that started making me a little bit suspicious. But the thing that really started prompting me to think that there probably was a lot more to this than just a natural virus was that the virus then suddenly, within a few weeks, leapt all the way over 3,000 miles to the holy city of Qom in Iran, the center of Iran's political and religious elites. And in fact, there was a big front page story in the New York Times describing how the second global epicenter of the COVID outbreak was suddenly in Iran. Now, the two countries in the world that America was most hostile towards at that point in time were China and Iran. Iran is thousands of miles from China. And, when you're talking about suddenly a virus appearing in a city like Wuhan, which most Westerners have never even heard of, and then suddenly jumping to thousands of miles to an entirely different country like Iran, it started raising a lot of obvious questions. Now, the virus certainly hit a lot of other countries afterwards. For example, the next country that ended up having an epidemic was Italy. Spain came also. But when you look at, for example, this situation in Italy, the viral epidemic that hit Italy took place in northern Italy, Lombardy. 300,000 Chinese live and work in Lombardy.
That's right.
And many of them had just returned from the Lunar New Year holiday, in some cases from Wuhan. So you could easily imagine the virus getting there. 150,000 Chinese live and work in Spain. So Spain would certainly be a very plausible next stop for the virus. But Iran has one of the world's lowest Chinese populations. Only a few thousand Chinese live in Iran, and most of them actually live in the capital city of Tehran rather than the holy city of Qom. Furthermore, the epidemic that took place in Iran was unique in the world in that it hit Iran's political and religious elites more earlier than any other group of people in the country, in the world, had been attacked. For example, within a few weeks, you had a situation where 10% of Iran's entire parliament, the Majlis, had been infected by the virus. A dozen or 24 of Iran's top elderly leaders ended up being infected, and many of them died. All of this took place in Iran just a few weeks after America had assassinated Iran's top military leader. We're talking about really a very strange set of coincidences and the sort of thing that would make anybody suspicious. So as time went by and the disease started spreading into more parts of the world, it seemed to me more and more possible, or at least plausible, that what we were talking about was simply a biowarfare attack. And now the thing is, people, just as you say, aren't especially aware of it, but America has the oldest continuous biowarfare program in the world. We started our biowarfare program in the middle of the Second World War. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence that we used it to hit Japan's food supply. And we're planning also possibly to use it to attack Germany during the war, but the war ended before that point. So we've had this massive biowarfare infrastructure that's been in place for over 70 years. According to some estimates, we've probably spent $100 billion on these biowarfare programs, $100 billion over the years. In fact, the interesting thing is much of the evidence, much of the material on America's history of biological warfare and the biowarfare program actually comes from extremely reputable mainstream sources. We're not talking about fringe sources on the internet. We're talking about leading academics, leading scholars, leading authors who publish books, in many cases, books that have been glowingly reviewed by top experts. But since so little of it has ever been covered by the media, most people are not aware of it. For example, some of your listeners may be aware that there were some disputed accounts that America used biological warfare during the Korean War against the North Korean and Chinese forces. It's something that has been talked about a little bit here and there. But when you really look at the underlying evidence, documents released by the Freedom of Information Act, documentaries, it seems overwhelmingly likely that we did use biological warfare in the case of the Korean War. And so when you have a country that has a history of using biological warfare, that has invested $100 billion building a massive biological warfare infrastructure, and is suddenly in an international confrontation with Iran and China in the world, and suddenly mysterious viral epidemics appear in those two countries rather than any other place in the world, those are obviously things that any logical person would certainly investigate. Now, the interesting thing about it is, at the time those epidemics took place early on, in the first few months of 2020, it turns out the Iranians publicly accused America of having launched a biological warfare against their leadership and against their country. It was in the Iranian media. In fact, the former president of Iran filed a formal complaint with the United Nations accusing America of launching a biological warfare attack against Iran and its leadership. But since America dominates the world media infrastructure, America and its allies in the West dominate the media, none of that ever got into the American media. It was very, very briefly covered, for example, in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And the argument used against it was that since various biological experts had argued that, oh, the virus was obviously a natural virus, if the virus was natural, obviously it could not possibly be a biological warfare attack against Iran. Now, that's sort of the interesting progression things have taken. In other words, very early in 2020, when the outbreak first took place in China, there was actually a lot of fringe chatter on the internet, various accusations that might be a lab leak from the Chinese lab at Wuhan, or that even it might be a Chinese biological warfare weapon that somehow leaked out. But within a couple of months, the conventional wisdom, the sort of elite sentiment, both in the media and in the academic world, were that it was simply a natural virus. It was certainly not artificial. It was not biologically engineered. It was simply a natural virus that randomly had gotten into circulation in China from some animal. And that was basically where the story stood for about a year. In other words, the Trump administration, some members of the Trump administration did make some accusations that it might have leaked out of the Wuhan lab. But by and large, those accusations were dismissed by the media, and it was treated as certainly a natural virus. And that only started to change about 5 or 6 months ago. In fact, it was primarily one paper by a longtime science journalist named Nicholas Wade, who'd been science editor at the New York Times and spent about 30 years at the New York Times, who came out with a strong article, actually a self-published article that appeared in Medium, pointing to that there really was very little evidence that it was a natural virus and much more evidence that it was an artificial virus, something that came out of a laboratory. And in the last 5 or 6 months since then, the entire debate in the media, therefore, is between the natural virus scenario and the lab leak scenario. And there have been a lot of other journalists who now have shifted over to the perspective that it's probably a lab leak that came from the Wuhan lab in China. But what is so strange to my mind is those have been the two scenarios debated almost entirely in the media, and virtually no one has considered the obvious third possibility, that it was a deliberately released virus. And if it was deliberately released in Wuhan, China, then almost certainly China was not the guilty party, and it would have come from another source, most likely the United States, for the other reasons that I've described.
Yeah.
So, it's basically the entire debate has been between two possible scenarios. And both the mainstream media and even to a large extent, most of the alternative media has simply ignored the third possibility, that it was a deliberately released virus, which I think has by far the most evidence behind it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember regarding that theory, what was very interesting to me was actually the military games that took place in Wuhan right in, what was it, October, I believe, right? Here's some footage even from that. And there were accusations, I believe, early on, even from China itself, that said that potentially one of the participants, perhaps, and so forth, because, of course, you had people from all countries all over the world there. And so if we kind of had a patient zero there of sorts, that would be a perfect place to then, all these people go back, all the soldiers go back to their respective countries and so forth. And again, think of it, it would be the military initially, and that environment, that world, that would be hit the hardest, right? So what do you make of this?
Well, my perspective on that issue is a little different. I'd actually found out of the Wuhan military games from a Chinese blogger around mid to late January. And in fact, we republished his lengthy article, and then I included in my article. I personally think it's very unlikely that the virus was spreading in Wuhan, China, among the participants in the military games. There have been some reports that have come out since then about some of the participants saying that they felt a little bit sick afterwards, or they suspected that they might have been infected. And in fact, some pro-Chinese propagandists have argued that the virus accidentally spread through the American participants in the military games if the virus had already been in circulation in the United States. However, I really don't view those scenarios as very likely for one key reason. The single most important characteristic of the COVID virus is that it's exceptionally infectious. In other words, once it becomes prevalent in any sort of community, once even a few people become infected, within a few weeks, it becomes a local epidemic. In other words, typically the doubling time with the original virus was about every 3 to 6 days. And so the way it leaked, for example, into parts of the United States is a few people in a given city might become infected, 2 or 3 people. And then within a month, you would have a massive outbreak. And that's exactly what happened in Wuhan, China. Now, if it turned out any of the participants, the thousands of participants who attended the military games, had become infected at that point and taken it back to their home country, those countries would have had massive epidemics months before they actually did. In other words, in the United States, nobody would even have paid any attention to the outbreak in China because America would have had a massive epidemic in December and January rather than in March, April, and May. The way I think the military games came into place is that if America were trying to seed a virus in a city like Wuhan, the military games would have provided the ideal opportunity. 300 American military servicemen participated, and there were thousands of servicemen from all these other countries in the world attending. They were sightseeing, they were traveling around the city. There was no way for the Chinese to monitor all of their activities. So if America were launching a biowarfare attack in Wuhan, it would be very easy for America to slip a couple of operatives in that group of 300 participants. And as they were traveling around the city, as they were sightseeing, as they were doing whatever they did, it would be very easy for them then to surreptitiously release the virus, which only would become noticeable then weeks later after they'd gone home. And the timing is extraordinarily suspicious. And that seemed to me very clear from the beginning. Because when scientists then have traced the genetic mutational path of the virus, and also the epidemiological timing of the virus, the conventional wisdom is that patient 0 in Wuhan became infected either towards the end of October or the beginning of November. The military games took place right at the end of October. So in other words, that would be exactly the point when the virus suddenly was spread in Wuhan. And that would be, it's really an astonishing coincidence if you had all of these American participants and suddenly the virus broke out. The analogy I use with people is that 300 Chinese military servicemen were visiting the city of Chicago in the United States. And immediately after they left, there was a mysterious viral outbreak in the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
I think most Americans would be extremely suspicious of those developments.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's definitely true. Now, of course, one thing that I always try to figure out with this here regarding, the lab theory. I mean, we know that they've done work on these viruses for decades and decades, right? There's even a patent trail, and I am not sure how much you go into that, if at all, and so forth. So we could venture down that route if you want to. But one of the things that has been a big question to me is, it doesn't see, so they've tinkered with this, right? We have for example, Project Diffuse. There were some documents recently that came out to kind of seem to verify that at least Fauci, with the intermediary EcoHealth Alliance, had approached the DoD or DARPA specifically to create the what they call the chimeric virus, right? They wanted to be more transmissible to humans. They were even researching or proposing in this paper. They wanted $14 million for it, and they proposed a skin-penetrating nanoparticle, like very advanced type of biowarfare agents. This could be disseminated anywhere, presumably in a very easy way. You would walk around literally with something spraying out of a backpack of a military personnel that's dressed in civilian clothing, whatever, at an airport or several, or at a busy mall or something, right? But one thing I couldn't parse is the virus does not seem that deadly unless you have underlying issues. Now maybe there's a difference what hit Iran versus what later came to some European cities and America later on and so forth. That's the only thing that it feels to me that if it was this biowarfare agent, could they have made it deadlier, or is that part of the program as well, not to ensure that literally everybody would drop dead right away? Have you thought about that?
Oh, sure. Well, there are different types of biowarfare weapons, obviously. It's a very broad field. COVID was not an anti-personnel bioweapon. It was an anti-economy bioweapon. Right. In other words, most of the estimates seem to be that the fatality rate, obviously it's very sharply age skewed based on underlying conditions, based on weight, things like that. But by and large, the fatality rate for Westerners is about 0.5 to 1%. And it seems roughly the same for East Asians or Chinese as well. Now, obviously, a bioweapon with a fatality rate of 1% will not destroy a country. It will not kill the population, but it will have a tremendous effect on the society and economy of that country. Because when you have an extremely contagious but low lethality bioweapon, obviously, something that would kill 1% of the population, the country's government needs to take tremendous measures against it. And it causes tremendous fear. It disrupts the economy. It disrupts society. And that, in turn, has a tremendous impact on the economy. So it was intended, to the extent that the scenario is correct, it's basically an anti-economy bioweapon. In fact, one interesting thing that came up very early was that an individual who very much appears to be a retired 40-year veteran of American biodefense, ended up having a number of very extended remarks on the whole issue on a website. And I made arrangements then to republish as an article on our website right towards the beginning of February. He really, and I ended up looking into it, and it does seem to be that his background is what he claimed to be. He's basically spent 40 years working for Dietrich and other biodefense facilities. And he argued that a low lethality, high contagion virus like basically COVID is absolutely ideal for destroying an economy. And that's exactly the way it was aimed at China. In other words, when you think about it also, if America had used a very high lethality bioweapon against China, killed tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of Chinese, the result obviously would probably have been nuclear war. I mean, you can't bottle up something like that. Well, if you're talking about something that is much, much, much less lethal, that would, kill a fraction of 1% of the population probably, but tremendously disrupt the economy, you can basically argue that it probably was a natural virus. In other words, it's much easier to cover it up. It's much easier to say, to believe that unless the Chinese ever acquired hard proof of what happened, they wouldn't simply be in a position to retaliate. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the interesting thing is the virus appeared at exactly the right time to become prevalent in Wuhan, in the city of Wuhan, right before Chinese Lunar New Year, which was basically towards the end of January. And so we're talking about basically the city of Wuhan, with the doubling time of 3 to 6 days, the city of Wuhan basically would have become very heavily infected with its population of this virus, with Wuhan being the key transit hub, and with 450 million Chinese traveling in Lunar New Year, spreading the virus through all parts of the country, making it endemic, impossible to control. and dealing a devastating blow to the Chinese economy and Chinese society, and possibly even causing the fall of the communist regime in China. Now, the only reason that didn't happen, remember, we're talking about an entirely new virus that nobody suspected the existence of. The Chinese government first discovered that it was in Wuhan right towards the end of December. And they ended up reacting incredibly quickly, so that within 2 weeks, they ended up locking down the entire city of Wuhan. 11 million people in Wuhan locked down. The lockdown then was spread to the rest of Hubei province and then the rest of China overall, so that China ended up locking down 700 million Chinese. It was 1,000 times larger than the largest lockdown, the largest medical quarantine in the history of the world. And with that sort of measure taken so quickly, they ended up controlling the spread of the virus, stamping it out. And within a month or two, Wuhan and the rest of China was back to normal because they controlled the virus. If they had not taken those steps, which nobody could have predicted, given the fact that it was unique in the history of the world, I mean, they locked down 700 million people, they would have been unable to control the spread of the virus. It would have spread throughout the entire country, probably eventually killed some millions of Chinese, and totally disrupted their society and economy. So in other words, they avoided that disastrous fate by a very narrow margin. And I think that basically was the intent that was aimed at them. Now, one thing I should also say with regard to the whole issue of a biowarfare attack against China, when you're looking at something like that, you really have to decide who probably was involved. Now, with America being most hostile to China and Iran, and those countries being hit first and hardest by the virus, I mean, the evidence clearly points in America's direction, but then you have to ask who in America was involved. When the virus then started leaking back into the United States, Donald Trump and most of the top people in his administration ignored the entire problem. They paid no attention to it. They basically reacted in such a way that it was very clear that Trump had no idea there had been a biowarfare attack against China, and that the same virus was now leaking back into the United States. America basically reacted in a very lackadaisical sort of way. We botched the original tests that we tried to produce to even monitor the virus produced by the CDC. So we couldn't even monitor its progress in the country. And so for that reason, it seems to me extremely unlikely that Trump himself was at all aware of what was happening. Now, under normal circumstances, it is simply inconceivable that the leader of a major country would be unaware of a biowarfare attack or any major attack being launched against one of its primary international rivals. But America is not a normal country. And the Trump administration was an exceptionally unusual administration in that regard. I don't know how much you followed some of the books and articles that have come out, inside stories of what happened in that administration, but you had the top officials in that administration ignoring Trump, running around him. In some cases, they said that they would hide his executive orders so that they would hope he would forget about his own executive orders and not issue them. So what I think probably happened is that a small handful of officials near the top of the Trump administration, probably people associated with some of the deep state neocons like Mike Pompeo or John Bolton, decided to launch a strike against America's top international rival, China, and then also probably hit Iran, and did so entirely without any knowledge on Trump's part. And then, the result is basically once the virus then leaked back into the United States and also ended up contaminating, for example, some of our allies in Western Europe, Italy was hit very hard, Spain was hit hard, Britain, Germany to some extent. Obviously these are individuals who would be extraordinarily unwilling for any of the truth of what happened to get out there. And I think all those other attacks were entirely collateral damage caused by the fact that the virus was much more contagious and spread much more rapidly than I thought. Now, one thing I should add, and then, you're certainly welcome to ask any questions. The first issue that comes up when I point that out to people is they say, oh, how could anybody have believed that the virus would not spread back to the United States, that would not infect the rest of the world? And the truth is, the historical pattern was very different than that. For example, the SARS virus originally appeared in China in 2002 and 2003. It was extremely lethal. I think it had about a 15% lethality rate. And the world at first was terrified that it might spread and devastate all the other countries in the world. But it ended up being confined almost entirely to China. There were minor outbreaks in a few other countries, and it never spread in any significant way to the United States. Similarly, the MERS coronavirus outbreak, which took place, I think, in 2007 and 2008 in the Middle East, again, it hit parts of the Middle East very hard. It never spread back to the United States. So, under those circumstances, you can imagine a small group of individuals being overly reckless in their action and taking steps that basically ended up having consequences that they wouldn't expect. Another point I should make is that America dominates the world of propaganda. The American media and its allies in the West totally dominate the world media, which gives us certain tremendous advantages in international confrontations, certainly much more than the media of many of our adversaries, like, for example, Russia or China or Iran or any of the other countries around the world. But one problem with dominating the media and dominating the world of propaganda is you many times start to then believe your own propaganda. And that's a tremendous problem for a country. For example, it later came out that in 2019, an international body had produced basically a chart and basically done a survey of which countries in the world would be best situated to cope with any disease outbreak that might suddenly appear anywhere in the world, any sudden plague that would appear. America was ranked number one. America was regarded as the country in the world best able to cope with the outbreak of any mysterious new virus or other epidemic. Britain was ranked number two. China was down around 50 or 60. So that anybody looking at the international groups that monitor that sort of thing would think America would be able to cope with an outbreak like that very effectively. And so there's actually one more point I should make. It turns out when you look at, for example, the pattern of events that took place before the outbreak in China, there are some extraordinarily suspicious circumstances. A man named Robert Cadlick, who most people have never heard of, has spent decades as America's leading biowarfare expert and advocate. He'd served that role in the Bush administration as early as the late 1990s. He'd become one of the leading writers on biowarfare issues, advocating it as a very useful means of defeating or damaging an international adversary, and doing so in a plausibly deniable manner, including hitting their food supply. Donald Trump brought Cadlick into his administration in 2017 and gave him a senior position. In 2018, a mysterious viral epidemic suddenly appeared to devastate China's poultry industry. In 2019, a viral epidemic appeared devastating China's pork industry, its primary meat source. And then towards the end of 2019, the Wuhan virus appeared. Now, it turns out from January to August 2019, America had been running an exercise called the Crimson Contagion exercise, in which state and federal officials spent 8 months diagramming and working out how they would deal with the consequences of a mysterious viral epidemic that might suddenly appear in China. And Cadlick was the individual running those exercises. So we're talking about basically exercises aimed directly at protecting America from a virus exactly of the sort that appeared 2 months after the end of the exercise. Now, if somebody hears something like a Crimson Contagion exercise dealing with biowarfare in the way I've said, it sounds like a fringe idea that was circulated in areas of the internet by crackpots. The way I found out about it, there was a front page story in the New York Times describing all the details of the exercise. So when we're talking about running biowarfare exercises to protect America against any leakage from a virus that would suddenly appear in China, and after 8 months of those exercises, a virus of exactly that sort does appear in China, the coincidences that we're adding up simply become too numerous to be anything but extremely suspicious.
Oh, absolutely. And again, a lot of things here, a lot of things you mentioned already. It's like, I got to bring this up and that up. But let's do this. Let's do this first.
Absolutely.
So the initial response was erratic, to say the least, right? We had denial, then I think we had overreach, and what initially started. I even remember early on the Democrat side and a lot of the liberals and progressives out there were like, no, it's not that serious. In fact, it was even racist when Trump proposed that we lock down, close to border, and especially towards China and some of these countries, right? Would not the attempt to like cover it up, or as you said before, that even some executive orders were hidden from Trump and so forth, like that this erratic thing kind of seemed to indicate that whoever did this also did not want America to deal with the spread of this virus either in a good way. Or how do we parse that, do you think?
Well, I would tend to argue the other way. In other words, what we're talking about, if we were talking about something that was organized by the American government, as the American government, that had gone through numerous staff meetings and, Pentagon planning sessions, and then if the end result was this sort of haphazard, lackadaisical, disastrously incompetent reaction, then I think you would certainly have a good point. However, I really think all the evidence based on Trump's reaction once the virus started coming to the United States is that he was not involved. And if you have the president of the United States not involved in an American biowarfare attack, it obviously was a rogue operation. I think my guess is it probably would have been organized by a very small group of people, maybe a half dozen people, probably including one or two people near the top of his administration, with Pompeo and John Bolton being the most likely suspects. But a small group of people basically that decided to take down America's international rivals without informing Trump of what they were planning. Now, when the operation then was actually carried out, it would have been carried out by standard American elements of the national security apparatus. In other words, the virus itself probably was obtained from Fort Detrick or one of our other biowarfare labs. The individuals who distributed the virus in Wuhan or possibly got it into Iran were probably members of our special forces, CIA operatives, something like that. All those lower level individuals assumed that they were participating in a fully authorized government operation. In other words, everybody knew that America was, in a confrontation with China. And so if they had then received orders from people far above them in the chain that they were given the go-ahead to launch a biowarfare attack to, damage China's economy, they would have then gone ahead and done it. I mean, after all, that's the sort of thing they had spent probably 10 or 20 or 30 years training for. It was exactly why America had spent $100 billion building its biowarfare infrastructure. So essentially what happened, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, the famous movie, Dr. Strangelove, where you have a base commander that launches a nuclear attack against Russia without presidential authorization. That's my scenario what happened in real life. In other words, somebody at a fairly high level got together with a small group of his, allies or conspirators and decided to go ahead with it, then ordered the people far below him in the chain to implement the attack. And one of the people who was not informed was the president of the United States. And so then when the virus came back to the United States, he had no idea what it was. And it could very well be those people told him, it was probably a Chinese bioweapon, or maybe it was a Chinese land leak. It's not clear what they would have told him. But I mean, the initial reaction of the United States was so disorganized that I think it makes it very clear the country as a whole was not involved in the operation. Now, some people say it was deliberate, that it would cause these lockdowns in the United States, that would cause all these massive economic changes. I'm really very skeptical of that. In other words, think of the fact that we had 8 months of the Crimson Contagion exercise from January to August of 2019 to prepare the country, to prepare its health officials against a potential virus like that. Now, they ended up not being sufficiently prepared. But when you organize that sort of defensive exercise, you certainly don't seem like you're deliberately having something happen. And also the reaction, when you look at it, what America was suddenly faced with was a virus invisibly spreading in our society, a very contagious virus that China was then coping with. And nobody really knew how to handle it because we'd botched the production of the CDC testing kits. So we couldn't even detect whether individuals were becoming infected in individual cities. And in fact, the first lockdown that took place was in my part of the country. It was implemented by the local public health officer of Santa Clara County, entirely on her own authorization, along with some of the other Bay Area health officers. They decided that the country was facing a devastating threat. The virus seemed to be spreading invisibly in Santa Clara County. And they thought that they would have to lock down the Bay Area to prevent the virus from spreading, just like China had successfully controlled the virus through a lockdown. That then spread to the lockdowns then were implemented in other parts of the country, including first California and then New York City and other places as it spread. And I think the reason the lockdowns were used was simply that it worked in China. China had stamped out the virus very effectively, and nobody else had any idea how to control it. I mean, how do you control an invisibly spreading, extremely contagious virus? Since we'd never faced anything like that before, and nobody was at that point entirely sure about the fatality rate, they decided to simply do what the Chinese had done. And the problem in the United States was that our lockdowns were so haphazard and disorganized, they never successfully stamped out the virus. In other words, within a month or two, China was back to normal. All the people in China were living their normal lives again because the virus had been stamped out. In the United States, the lockdowns were so ineffective that they ended up remaining in place in many cases for almost a year. So we ended up with really the worst of both worlds. In other words, according to most estimates, probably about 1 million Americans have died from the COVID virus, or close to 1 million. While on the other hand, our entire society and economy was totally disrupted now for 2 years. And, in other words, certainly the result was disastrous for the United States, but I really tend to doubt it was intentional in any way.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have the depression with social isolation, you have drug issues, you have, the audience know this. I'm very skeptical of the PCR test and so forth. Even the original inventor of them, was it Mulligan? I forget his last name now, but he mentioned this, that, basically...
Kary Mullis.
Thank you. Exactly. Kary Mullis mentioned that it was not intended to be used in the way that, they've ended up using it and so forth, right? But even the masking issue, right? And same thing there, really. There is actually a lot of studies on the masking issue, and it's very, negligible, positive effects that this have, right? But we read something the other day here on one of the shows how now we're learning that this is impairing children's ability to read faces and so forth, that they're actually developing mental and social issues because they're those who choose to be masked all the time, or teachers around them and other kids and so forth, right? So we have, if we want to try to find out what the costs, so to speak, are going to be here, it's way too early to tell, because this might go roll on for a generation after this. We don't even know yet, right? So this is, but one thing I want to go back to,
sure,
is the issue there of the Chinese reaction, right? Because I remember again early on, I was very, I take this into account as well, and I'm wondering if the establishment media is smart enough to be aware of the thing I'm going to mention here, but there's a large contingent on the internet, and we've had rumors of, even people like Hillary Clinton have mentioned we're losing the information war, right? They're very aware that there's a large faction, mostly active on the internet and so forth, that is skeptical of mainstream media. They always go kind of in the opposite direction of what they do and so forth, right? The media doesn't really have to bother with the people that constantly obey them and listen to them, right? That they have those, already have those under control. So reasonably, they would be interested in those they cannot control in some way, because the way that they denied it first in the media, and then looking at what the reactions were in China, and we were told, China don't want these videos to come out. We saw people standing in the streets and just keeling over, right, and like these very dramatic videos that even when we saw that they. I remember they welded shut doors and stairwells and things like that, right, and other such videos. And then I remember later on, Revolver News is one of the sites that did a very good job going through some of those videos that a lot of us were really scared by early on, and said many of them, and maybe not 100%, but many of them that spread online were from something completely different. There was tests, there was drill, there were these had nothing to do with it, because we didn't really see those things, at least in the West, of people just falling over, dropping dead. I even remember one news story where they said that there was 3 Chinese people that had turned black because of the COVID virus or something. And it turns out most of these were just kind of made up or taken out of context or something. But my point in bringing this up is that there seems to have been initially there seemed to be a cover-up of this by China. Now, if they would have been if they were aware at least that they were attacked by the U.S., would it stand to reason that they would, instead of covering up, highlighting it and say, we were just attacked, look at this, and try to benefit from this on the international stage in some capacity, as opposed to kind of, putting the lid on this and dealing with it internally? I don't know. Is that a contradiction?
I mean, I've looked into that quite a bit, and my perspective is a little bit different than that. In other words, based on all the evidence I've seen, the Chinese government only found out about the virus spreading right towards the end of December, the last couple of days of December. In fact, the local government probably found out a few days later. And then the national Chinese government probably only discovered the existence of the virus towards the end of December. And remember, at that point, not a single Chinese person had yet died. The Chinese then basically cracked down on the virus and tried to control it within about 2 or 3 weeks. They certainly lost a few days. In other words, there was a big Wall Street Journal investigative piece on it that described how the Chinese had missed 6 or 7 days at a crucial point and ignored the spread of the virus, when if they'd reacted more quickly, it could have had a very different effect. So, their government made some mistakes. The local officials in some cases tried to ignore the thing. But the government only found out what was happening right at the end of December. And it was by mid-January that they ended up basically locking down the city of Wuhan and taking the necessary corrective action. Now, what I found very suspicious when I started looking into these things is by mid to late January, at a time when nobody in the rest of the world was really paying much attention to what was going on in Wuhan, China, it was a small item in the New York Times. There already had become a massive anti-China propaganda campaign by various anti-China bloggers, anti-China tweeters, anti-China websites, many of them associated with the Falun Gong and Epoch News, Epoch Times or whatever it's called. So you basically had a massive anti-China propaganda campaign promoting exactly the videos you're talking about. In other words, videos that seemed to say China was collapsing, China was being destroyed by this virus, sometimes claiming that it was a Chinese bioweapon that had leaked out of one of their labs and was therefore devastating their society. Now, all of those videos you're talking about were promoted and distributed by anti-China websites, anti-China bloggers, anti-China social media personalities, that sort of thing. And so it stands to reason that they probably were produced by anti-China groups. In other words, there are a lot of groups, again, associated with the Falun Gong that are very, very hostile to China. And it would be a very natural thing that they would produce videos, even if they weren't directly involved with the biowarfare attack, that would seem to indicate that China was collapsing. It's the sort of thing. There have been various writers who've been claiming now for 20 years that China was about to collapse. I think Gerald Chang or Gordon Chang, for 20, 25 years, he's written a series of articles saying the Chinese economy is about to collapse. And so you have a situation suddenly where there is this lethal, mysterious disease outbreak in one of China's largest cities. Nobody knows the exact details of what's happening, but you have people basically claiming that it came from China and it would destroy Chinese society. And I think that made me really quite suspicious because they were the only people in the world focusing on the issue at that point. And what's really interesting is that then a couple of months later, 2 or 3 months later, when elements of the American national security establishment, like Mike Pompeo, CIA officials, started describing what they suspected had happened, they said, it was probably a virus that leaked out of the Wuhan lab.
Yeah.
They were proposing exactly the same thing that those early propaganda videos had sometimes argued. And some of them talked about, for example, a virus coming from bats or something like that. But many of them also argued it was a Chinese virus that leaked out of the Wuhan lab. So it seemed to me what probably was going on was that the individuals involved in orchestrating this biowarfare attack against China, since they knew what was about to happen, then organized certain elements of these groups to launch a propaganda campaign targeting China before anybody even knew what was going on. You see, the whole thing about it is if the first thing anybody heard about this mysterious virus on the internet was that it was a Chinese virus that leaked out of the Wuhan lab or even possibly a Chinese bioweapon, that would anticipate any Chinese charges that might come out later. In other words, if everybody was talking about it leaking out of the Wuhan lab, then the Chinese, if they reacted in 2 or 3 months, people wouldn't pay as much attention to it. The other thing also that did was that forced a lot of American scientists then, in some ways, to react and say, no, it wasn't a Chinese bioweapon. It was a natural virus. And once they ended up putting in place with articles, for example, in Nature Medicine and Science, the case there was a natural virus, then when the Iranians accused America of launching a biowarfare attack, the response was the Iranians are crazy. Everybody knows it's a natural virus. It couldn't have been an American biowarfare attack. So I'm not saying I can predict how much of that stuff was planned or coordinated, but I found it very suspicious that there was a massive internet propaganda campaign attacking China as being the source of the virus before almost anybody else in the world was paying any attention to the issue.
Yeah.
And that propaganda campaign was not coming from China.
Now, would this mean then that the military contingent that you're talking about here, and we know it's very compartmentalized, and even the people that would actually be part of releasing something like this would potentially not even know what they're doing, right? That's how these things go. But anyway, that would mean that the release of this bioweapon would, the contingent here, that group inside the military doing this, they don't, in your view, control then the media. They don't have the ability, at least, to largely on a bigger scale control the narrative in the media, because that seems to, at least at a time before it was like unified, seems to go off in an opposite direction, perhaps, right? I'm very conspiratory minded. It's just kind of my nature in a way, right? So I see, cooperation. I see even international cooperation here. That I see less, let's say, open. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, of course, and definitely a little bit maybe lower ranks and so forth. But the cooperation on an international scale, because if we talk about the EcoHealth Alliance connection for a moment, which does, of course, tie into Wuhan, and it looks like, if all of that's correct, unless that's another, red herring or meant to take us down a rabbit hole intentionally, which could very well be, and I want to get your take on that, but it seems to indicate that the work, at least, of gain of function and so forth that was outlawed under Obama, I forget, 2014 or something like that, right? Fauci under NIAID goes on and says, well, let's hire this third party, EcoHealth Alliance, which consequently took it over to Wuhan and allegedly continued, kind of the work there. And if the Chinese are doing that there and developing it there, that seems to kind of indicate, at least to me, that there's an international cooperation here, right? There's elements in China and there's elements in America. There's elements even in other countries. I think Canada, there were some trails to Canada regarding a virus. France, I think, was one of the main countries that were helping China to build these very, stage 4, biowarfare weapon containment facilities, essentially. But how do you parse that, or what's your thoughts on that?
My perspective on that is a little bit different. Now, the first thing about it is, obviously, the main scenario the media has been promoting for the last 6 or 7 or 8 months has been the lab leak scenario. In fact, a series of books have come out, a series of nonfiction books, basically arguing the case for the lab leak. But there really seems almost no evidence for any leak from the Wuhan lab. In other words, one interesting thing that hasn't received enough attention is there's the single most credible source we have for what was going on in the Wuhan lab is an experienced Australian virologist named Danielle Anderson. She was actually at the Wuhan lab in the period in question. She was working there. She'd spent a number of months there. Some of the arguments made by the Trump administration were that, the Wuhan lab had no safety provisions. It was very careless, and that's why the virus would have leaked out. She was there at the time, and she has, in an interview with Bloomberg, has said that the safety provisions of the Wuhan lab were absolutely outstanding. In fact, she urged her own lab in Australia to start adopting some of them. She also said that there was absolutely no indication, and she worked very closely with the people there, there was no indication that the people there were working on anything like the COVID virus. There was no indication anybody at the lab became ill in any way in the time in question that some people have proposed. And there's basically, she's very, very skeptical that it came out from the Wuhan lab. And the whole thing about it is, you have to separate the two parts of the lab leak scenario. There's a tremendous amount of evidence now that the virus is not natural, that it was bioengineered. And, that's basically what people have been talking about for the last 6 or 7 or 8 months. But there's absolutely zero evidence that it leaked out of the Wuhan lab. Absolutely zero evidence. And, we have an eyewitness there. We have all the other facts involved. I mean, basically, the Wuhan lab, they published you have to say whether it was a secret project or not. Now, if it were a secret project, it presumably would have been some sort of biowarfare project. But the Wuhan lab is not an institution that would have been involved normally with that sort of thing. And also, they basically have published a lot of papers over the years dealing with all sorts of different viral developments. And there's no indication any of those papers show that they were working on anything like the COVID virus. So I'm not saying it's impossible that it came from the Wuhan lab, but there's absolutely zero evidence that it came from the Wuhan lab. And the one most credible source we have there says she's absolutely sure it probably didn't. So we then have to ask ourselves, why was Fauci and why were American officials funding some of this research at the Wuhan lab? Now, the truth is, most of the money that was coming to the EcoHealth Alliance with the Peter Daszak, I think his name was, most of it was coming from the CIA or the Pentagon. It was coming from America's national security establishment, oriented towards biodefense. And only a tiny, tiny fraction of it was given to the Wuhan lab. I think probably like about 1 or 2% of their funding. It was spread out for labs all across the world. Some people have plausibly argued that it was a means from the CIA and the Pentagon, America's national security establishment, to use the lure of this funding to gain intelligence on the bio research being done in labs all around the world, including the Wuhan lab. I think the figure I saw is America gave something like $600,000 to the Wuhan lab in 2018 or 2019. I think the total amount of money we gave to the Wuhan lab via Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance was like a couple of $1 million. Now, looking at it logically, if we're talking about a country, China, that has a multi-trillion-dollar economy, we're talking about massive government national security spending of hundreds of billions of dollars. Does it make any sense at all that America could give a few $100,000 a year to a biowarfare lab and suddenly gain, influence or control over the resources? The only way I think probably could have been involved, and by the way, I personally think neither Peter Daszak nor Fauci nor any of those people were probably aware at all about this biowarfare attack. They simply were involved in working with the Wuhan lab in an entirely different way. The way their involvement might have come in is that people have noticed that the Wuhan lab did have a precursor virus that's the closest match to the COVID virus. It's not an exact match, but I think it's about 96 or 97% similar. So it's the closest match anywhere in the world. And that's why people, again, suspect that it might have come from the Wuhan lab. But the point about it is, if we were giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to this research facility, if our bio researchers were on a very friendly basis there, were going there, meeting them with them periodically, and even supporting some of their research, it probably would have been not very difficult for us to obtain samples of some of their viruses that they were working on, in an academic way. And those viruses could have then been used as the precursors for the development of biowarfare virus in the United States, so as to throw the suspicion in a different direction. In other words, if you're launching a biowarfare attack against another country, if you're developing the capability of something like that, you obviously want to make sure that the fingerprints are not on your hand, but are pointing in a different direction. And obviously, getting a Chinese virus as the precursor for the COVID virus would be the ideal way of ensuring that.
Now, there are, of course, a lot of people that talked about this before the outbreak happened, and there's another thing here that you mentioned, which is interesting as well, which is, when did the first cases kind of arise? Right, here's a Newsweek piece, talking about this, that it was, I forget how. I think they trace it back to November 17th, 2019, possibly a 55-year-old individual from the Hubei province. Although patient zero has yet to be found. There was also one. Let me see if I can find the right story here. It was a story from study out of Norway, actually. I had it up here in a moment ago. Anyway, that one detailed too, that they said that it probably spread much earlier than we actually believed at first. Right? Let me see here. Where is it? Okay, I can't find it now. It doesn't matter. But the point is, it could have been circulating a long time before this. Go ahead.
I'm not sure about that. The whole thing about it is it's an extremely contagious disease. Now,
Right.
when it spreads in a given city, if a few people have it, there's a perfectly reasonable chance it may die out. But if it doesn't die out, I mean, once it gains some traction, in other words, once basically a dozen or 2 dozen people have it, it then grows exponentially. And within a month or two, you have a massive outbreak. That happened in Wuhan. It happened in Lombardy. It happened in Spain. It happened in many cities around the United States. So, the best evidence that people have when they've looked at, for example, the mutational trail of the virus and trying to work backwards to see when patient zero occurred, or the epidemiological trail. In other words, when people first noticed in Wuhan, the evidence seems to be that the patient zero probably was towards the end of October or the beginning of November. There's some error bars, but probably from mid-October to mid-November would be the time that the virus broke out in Wuhan. There have been some claims using, for example, wastewater analysis and PCR tests and wastewater analysis that the virus might have been present, for example, in parts of the United States many months earlier in 2019. A trace was, for example, found in Spain. There have been about 6 or 7 different cases where old samples were found that seemed to show traces of the virus many months before you logically would expect it there. But the problem is, just as you mentioned, many of these tests are prone to tremendous numbers of false positives. And when you really sit down and look at the 6 or 7 academic studies that were done, supposedly finding evidence of the virus having been present in these places earlier, their wastewater samples or blood samples, it basically falls apart. In other words, you have a situation where, for example, there was one positive that was found in Spain, I believe in March of 2019, and every successive sample for the next 8 months found absolutely nothing at all. And then it finally appeared in Spain right towards the end of the year, the beginning of 2020. So it seems very likely to be a false positive. In fact, some of the tests done in the United States show that you typically get 95% false positives, 99% false positives. And so I don't think there's any evidence the virus was anywhere in the world prior to around the beginning of November in Wuhan, China.
You know what and there's others talked about this too, but why it seems to be it's the response, at least later on, before the international community and various nations and so forth have kind of really homogenized their response of sort of like, how do we deal with this? And yes, to a certain extent, it's been very erratic, and then maybe they look at another country, what did that country do? And then they start emulating and so forth. So it's not necessarily that this has been a homogenous response, but I'd say now after a couple of years, we have a very, very similar things have happened in many countries, right? And people like Mike Yeadon, for example, the former, he worked for Pfizer initially. He was part of the research department, I forget which type, I think it was his virology or certain viruses. He was looking at that, but he was talking about that countries had certain protocols in place initially. Of what do we do if an outbreak happens? What protocols do we follow? What do we do and so forth? And he said, at least according to him, that most countries that had these ended up breaking all of those, kind of methods that they had in place, and went down a completely different route and an untested route. I remember even looking at the idea of lockdown. It was actually traced back to, believe it or not, it was a daughter of a researcher at Sandia Labs that initially did a computer modeling program where she, emulated a town and a city. And she ended up, basically, social distancing and locking certain things down as a form of containment and so forth. But it was been largely untested. And as you said, when Wuhan did this, never anything in history had happened like this before. You know what I mean? So it's a bit. But what I must add to it, though, is that there seems to be an awful lot of people that have jumped on the opportunity that this virus or whatever it is have offered them. To start bringing in certain policies and things and restrictions, which, frankly, many countries have had waiting in the pipeline. They've said, well, we would love to have a social credit score, for example, or why not a passport that's tied to your overall score, right? Whether it's a social credit score or a health score or something like that. That you've seen a rollout of things on the back of this virus, which seems to have benefited a lot of different international agendas out there. What do you think of that?
Well, I certainly agree with all of that. And, there's the old phrase, I think it was Manuel, who was Obama's chief of staff, who said, never let a crisis go to waste.
That's right.
In other words, there are a lot of these policies that people have had in place that have been planning for many years, and then suddenly a crisis comes along to justify the implementation of those policies. Some of those policies might be good, some of those policies might be harmful. But I don't think the fact that these policies were implemented provides much evidence of whether the people who implemented the policies were behind the original crisis.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Even it was intentional.
Absolutely.
And so the whole thing about it, one other point I should make is a lot of people then have pointed to some of these other exercises, like, for example, the World Economic Forum, various other, planning exercises to control a virus that have been fairly prominent for the last few years, dealing with different contagious exercises. One thing that I think is possible, it's just speculation, but it's possible. If you had a small group of people, some of whom were near the top of the Trump administration, who were planning to launch this biowarfare attack against China, it would make sense that then they would use the people in their orbit to help prepare America for the contingent results. In other words, it's not that they would go to, for example, the World Economic Forum and tell them we're planning to launch a biowarfare attack against China. They would simply go to those individuals, using their prestigious positions, and say, we're worried about viruses suddenly appearing in the world. There was SARS, there was MERS. There's always a chance of some dangerous virus outbreak taking place, and we should have more planning exercises to cope with that. And that's probably what happened with the Crimson Contagion exercise in the United States. And that's what probably might have been involved with a lot of these other planning exercises. So you have a situation probably where 99.99% of the people involved in those activities had no clue what was being planned. But they were then, I guess you could say, either encouraged or manipulated by the small group of people who were planning the exercise to go ahead with it. And there's one more point I should definitely get out there, which I think is the closest thing we have to a smoking gun in the whole biowarfare scenario. As I said, once the virus started leaking back into the United States, and the fact that we reacted in such an incompetent and lackadaisical way, Trump ignored it, Trump said it would basically go away or disappear by itself, it suddenly ended up by April being a gigantic disaster for the country. And what's interesting is in early to mid-April, 4 separate American intelligence sources then went to ABC News to try to justify their own behavior. And they basically said, it wasn't our fault that this total disaster is taking place in the United States with tens of thousands of Americans already dying. We were on top of it. It's the Trump administration. They didn't take advantage of the information we gave them. And they pointed out, they told ABC News, the Defense Intelligence Agency had produced a secret intelligence report describing a massive viral outbreak taking place in Wuhan, China, that had catastrophic implications, and urged the American government to take defensive action so that we wouldn't suffer. And basically, they distributed to the White House, they distributed to the top levels of the American government. And the American government sat on it, ignored it, and that's why we had the disaster. So that was a big ABC News story. It was obviously heavily promoted by all the people in the media who hated Donald Trump, who hated his reaction to the thing. But then somebody suddenly noticed something. The date of the secret intelligence report that was given to the top levels of the American government was November. November was before anybody in China was even aware of the viral outbreak. In November, probably no more than half a dozen or a dozen people in a city of 11 million people were starting to feel a little bit sick. And it was over a month before anybody in the top levels of the Chinese government became aware of this viral outbreak. So you had the Defense Intelligence Agency distributing a secret intelligence report warning of a disastrous viral outbreak taking place in Wuhan, China, before anybody in the world was aware of it. And so that immediately, suddenly, made people realize there was something very suspicious going on. And it turns out the Pentagon then officially denied the existence of the report. They said the report does not exist. It's just a figment of the imagination. Those people weren't telling the truth. But then 2 weeks later, Israeli TV was reported, of course the reports exist. It was given to Israel. It was given to the NATO allies. The reports certainly were distributed in exactly that sort of way. Mm-hmm. So there seems overwhelming evidence that a secret intelligence report by a unit of the Defense Intelligence Agency was produced in the second week of November, describing a potentially catastrophic disease outbreak taking place in Wuhan, China, when nobody else in the world would become aware of it for 6 or 7 weeks. And, I think the way you know something like that is if somebody informed you of what had happened.
Right, you're saying this is the indicator, at least to in their mind, their allies, that like get ready for something, or this could happen, right? Because again, maybe we have those classic clips, and we can't play it, and it's interesting to get your take on this. But a lot of chatter from different sources started to pop up around anywhere from October. I think it was even Tedros Ghebreyesus. Let's begin with that clip. Tedros Ghebreyesus. He's speaking at it's called a Global Preparedness Monitoring Board that was just opened up, and I think it's under the World Health Organization, that umbrella. This is September 22nd, 2019. Listen to this here.
Often ask me what keeps me awake at night. That's it. And I don't even think. I say pandemic flu. It comes just automatic. And you know the reason why. Now you have the detailed reason. But not only it wakes me at night, but very often. And we know that the next global influenza pandemic is simply a matter of when, not whether. And that's exactly what the report says. The world...
And he goes on from there. But yeah, you have that one, right? A famous one. And so people, okay, he's obviously given directives. I'm not saying this guy's in on it or anything like that, but he's, as a mouthpiece of one, global organization, an important one, especially in regards to the health issues and so forth, have been given the word somewhere. and that's why they're setting up a specific monitoring board. Leading off of this, and then I want your comment on this, but let's play the famous Fauci clip as well, him talking about how a surprise was coming. This is back in 2017, but again, I think there could be even maybe there's an Trump contingent here, and they wanted to surprise the administration. Anything is possible. Listen to Fauci here.
What I would bring that perspective to the topic today is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak. And I hope by the end of my relatively short presentation, you will understand why history, the history of the last 32 years that I've been the director of NIAID, will tell the next administration that there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they will be faced with the challenges that their predecessors were faced with.
There you go. Right. So that's interesting. The rumor was already there, circulating in all kinds of halls of power and international organizations.
Oh, I agree entirely. In other words, we can have a situation where only a very small number of people are actively involved in the effort, but they can then spread the general awareness of what might happen or preparedness issues to a much broader group of people in their circles, and it spreads from there. So, again, it's very difficult to know who would have been involved. I think it probably would have been a very small group of people. And what shocks me most really is that, given the bulk of this evidence, given, the secret intelligence report that we were distributing before anybody else in the world even was aware of the outbreak in Wuhan, it's really astonishing how none of this stuff has been covered, obviously, in the American mainstream media. And relatively little of it has even been discussed in the alternative media.
This one I didn't know about. This one was very interesting that we have up on screen now. That's a good, sure. It went under my radar for some reason. Very interesting.
Exactly. And it's the sort of thing where, we have a debate right now going on between the natural virus and the lab leak scenario. But there's a third case that's the most obvious, I think, and supported of all. And under that situation, the one reason I think the media and even the alternative media is so reluctant to even mention some of these things is the evidence is so overwhelming. In other words, we have an Australian virologist who was on the scene of the Wuhan lab She says there was no sign of a lab leak there. She's very skeptical the virus was developed there. She thinks it's very unlikely it would have come from there. And that right now is the only alternative being presented to the natural virus scenario. Well, if we're talking about something like a viral outbreak of this type, a biological warfare attack. I mean, we're talking about something now that has killed probably 20 million people around the world. It's created, this is the greatest event in world history since the end of the Second World War, the most impactful event. Nothing in the last 70 or 80 years has had the impact of this global epidemic. Probably 1 million Americans have died, and people are unwilling to explore the very obvious evidence pointing in the direction it goes. And what I find particularly striking about this is obviously the liberal media, the mainstream liberal media, hates and despises Donald Trump. They describe him as the center of all evil, the greatest threat to human life on planet Earth. And the things they focus on are the fact that he might send out a nasty tweet at 2 a.m. while he was still allowed to tweet. And we have a situation where there's tremendously strong circumstantial evidence that not he himself, but some of the people he brought into this administration launched an incredibly reckless biowarfare attack against China and Iran that ended up blowing back in the United States, disrupting our society for 2 years and probably killing 1 million Americans. And I mean, if you can't talk about something like that, I mean, why talk about anything at all? It just is amazing to me that all of this evidence has been sitting there for 2 years, and so few people have really been aware of it or talked about it. In fact, early on, for example, when I ended up publishing some of these articles by people, I mean, there was actually one very good article by Whitney Webb that was rejected by her outlet at the time on America's biowarfare programs regarding use of the sort of viruses that, bats deal with. And we ended up publishing, and that's the reason it got some attention. Same thing with a lot of these other articles we've published. So it just seems strange to me that more people have not focused on the trail of evidence, which, to my mind, really seems quite strong in all this.
There's a high noise ratio when it comes to these things, and I think part, frankly, also of if you want to cover something like this up, it's very advantageous to kind of just have a Hegelian dialectic, if you will, or a rock and a hard place. You can use any analogy that you want, but if you have two teams fighting, it's more likely, and only two teams. No, don't make it too complicated. Is it a lab leak or is it not? And you just get stuck between that. That's the only discussion you hear. And to a certain extent, as I said before, if you have the media taking a strong position on something, there is a large contingent on internet researchers and online, people in alternative media that kind of in a knee-jerk response will automatically go in the opposite direction, and you kind of get stuck in that way. So this is, of course, it's very important to to kind of look beyond that and see what other options there is. And usually there is. Usually there's always more to the story than what we're allowed to discuss. But at the same time, even the censorship, right, of the lab leak theory material early on is aiding and helping. So even let's say that they wanted to have it be a lab leak, that's like a look this way, right? That if you censor there, you have a Streisand effect, and it's like, oh, that's what they're trying to cover up. That's what really is going on, right? It's very clever. It's smart.
And another aspect of this situation is that since early on, alternative media, especially more right-wing alternative media, was so heavily drenched in all those videos showing huge numbers of Chinese dying, dropping dead on the street, all of the talk of a Chinese bioweapon. Once they found out that obviously those videos were fraudulent, and the death rate of the virus is more like 0.5% rather than 20% or 30%, they might have been burned enough by that as to stay away from the bioweapon scenario, since they'd sort of already gone through it and it turned out to be mistaken before. So that's part of it. Also, another thing I should probably mention is that there has been a clampdown on media, and it turns out, for example, when I published my first article on this, setting out really most of this evidence, it was in April 2020. And it ended up getting a tremendous amount of early visibility. I mean, more really readership than anything I'd published for a number of years. And then within days of that article being published, we were suddenly banned from Facebook, and all of our web pages were deranked from Google.
Yeah.
And once you're basically banned by the two largest gatekeepers of the internet, it's obviously much more difficult to get subsequent articles, broader attention.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. This is how they do it, right? But again, that doesn't always mean, depending on what they censor and so forth, that's what I'm saying is there could be in some instances at least that they're aware of, if we cover something up, then that's where a lot of people will spend their time looking,
Exactly.
kind of thing, right? But what about the? Let me ask you about, and I want to go into Operation Warp Speed and so forth, because of course Trump had a very big hand in that, and that was also a military rollout, which kind of connects a little bit with what you're talking about. But what about have you looked into the sequencing of the actual virus in and of itself, right? Because what we've heard, at least officially, is that China sequenced it. I forget what the date was, right? And then they basically just uploaded this to a database where other countries and so forth, researchers, scientists around the world could access this, and they got to work on this mRNA gene therapy, the vaccine, and so forth, the rollout of that. Are there any genetic markers here? What I'm saying is, are you aware of if this is at all advanced in the sense that it's targeting certain traits and so forth? Because again, stands to reason that at least they have the technology now that if they particularly wanted to target China, let's say, was there a genetic marker they could use? Did it hit I've heard contradictory information, right? I've heard some scientists say, no, it's actually white Europeans are the most, they have a ACE2 receptor uptake is very high among them and so forth. I remember some study out of the UK that said that I think Indians were more susceptible and so forth. What have you sorted any of that out yet? Because it's very, very contradictory to me.
Sure. Well, back in January, there was actually a lot of speculation floating around that the virus was especially aimed at East Asians, Chinese people in particular. In fact, early on, there was some speculation that Europeans, that Caucasians were almost immune. There were like one or two whites who'd been living in Wuhan who said that, they didn't have any problem with the virus. It was very mild for them. So there was a lot of speculation like that floating around early on. But then within a couple of months, it rapidly spread to other parts of the world. And obviously, the vast, vast majority of people who have now died from the virus have been Caucasians and in many cases Europeans. So there's absolutely no evidence that it particularly targets Asians. Recently, because China ended up stamping out the virus so effectively and only a few thousand Chinese died while 1 million Americans have died, there's sometimes been contrary speculation floating around on the internet that, the virus might be especially targeting whites or Europeans or Caucasians. But there doesn't really seem to be any evidence at all. For example, California has a large Asian population, including many Chinese. And when I've looked at, for example, the fatality rates relative to age distribution of both whites in California and Asians in California, they seem to be pretty similar. So, in other words, it's certainly possible that one group might be 10% more vulnerable or 20% more vulnerable than another group, but they're both basically in the same ballpark. And the tremendous issue of vulnerability is really age. That's the single biggest factor. Individuals who are, for example, older than 60, I think are probably 100 times more likely to die than individuals who are under 40. The secondary factor is weight. If you're overweight, it really is a much more dangerous virus to you. And then obviously there are other medical conditions as well. But those factors seem enormously larger than any racial factor. And though it's possible that eventually biowarfare weapons could be tailored on a racial basis, there's no evidence anybody's succeeded in doing that so far. And there's certainly no evidence that this virus in particular, targets one race rather than another race. So, you can imagine a lot of speculation like that floating around, but seems mostly unwarranted speculation.
Yeah, I think for a while at least, I know that this is, definitely more than a decade ago. I think it might even be two. So this is old by now, and I know that they have a lot of new research. A lot of things have happened in genomic sequencing and so forth. So they probably have a lot more today than they did then. But I remember the Israelis were trying to develop some kind of genetic specific weapon and so forth. But I think at least at that time, they said that there were so many similarities that it was very hard for them to find specific markers. But maybe they have broken through on that now and so forth. I don't know. It's very interesting, right? But I'm showing this. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just about to say that, back in January, the fact that it broke out that way in Wuhan, China, I actually dropped notes to a few people I know, including people who have pretty good knowledge of biotechnology issues, asking whether they thought it was all possible it might be a racially targeted bioweapon, targeting Han or targeting East Asians. And their opinion was probably the technology isn't quite there yet. In other words, eventually it'll be there, but it's probably not there yet. And then, once obviously it spread to all these other countries, we saw in this particular case, it simply wasn't that sort of bioweapon. It's certainly possible. It's possible somebody's already developed something like that.
Yeah.
But it just isn't true in this particular case.
No, I mean, at this point, we haven't seen, one population, they all die and everyone, it hasn't been that clear. Again, this is very, I would, sometimes we think it's maybe easier than it actually is. There's a lot of ins and outs to this, but I would assume that at least they're very interested in working on something like this to develop it. Now, if we talk about Operation Warp Speed a little bit, because of course Trump was at the forefront of this, and I'm not sure if you're aware at all of the work of someone like David Martin, who's kind of looked at the patent trail of this, and at least he claims that there's at least 10 years in the making of this mRNA vaccine and the rollout. There's even actually quite interesting work that's come out. I think it was even Glenn Beck. He was on Tucker Carlson talking about how Moderna owns the patent together with the NIH, I think it was, for this new mRNA vaccine that they've rolled out. The patent trail, if that's true, that seems to indicate that the vaccine rollout, at least because of it was, the work on coronaviruses, specifically in coronavirus vaccines, have been at least a decade-long research process and a patent process, seems to indicate that kind of goes hand in glove with this. And I also know, and we might differ on this, and that that's fine, doesn't matter. I think I read on your website you said that you were heavily criticized because you took and I believe in your words, kind of a very conventional view on the COVID vaccines. But
exactly.
to me, at least, it seems that the rollout of that ties directly in with it, and that we have another layer now. Maybe that's coincidental. Maybe there's another agenda on top of one, so it's never maybe a single timeline, a single trail like that. But it looks like the vaccine rollout has been specifically targeted towards the West specifically. I'm not too sure about the Sinovacs that they have, and I believe it's mRNA, but their success rate.
I don't think the Chinese are not using mRNA.
Oh, they're not? Okay, that's interesting.
One reason they don't have to is they stamped out the virus. So in other words, it's not something they have to control desperately. It's basically that, something they're trying to immunize their people. So they're using more conventional vaccines. Most other countries around the world, I think the Russians are mostly using conventional vaccines also. It's really America and the West that are using these new mRNA vaccines.
mRNA,
but
messenger
the whole thing
RNA.
At least I think the conventional story in the sort of media narrative is that these companies, a few of these biotechnology companies, had been working on these new types of vaccines for a number of years, developing them so that, in effect, if a virus came along, they would have a vaccine that they could use very, very quickly without the normal process of, having all the tests and everything like that run for the virus. So I think the conventional story is that once they had the genetic blueprint of the COVID virus, in other words, once the Chinese released it into the international database, I think like the first day of January, the second day of January, they were then able to take that genetic blueprint, add it to their mRNA base, and then in a very short period of time have a vaccine that they could distribute very widely. So, they were certainly working on this type of vaccine for many years, but I don't think there's any evidence that they were working on the COVID virus. But they could sort of, in effect, it's a question of having a sort of vehicle that they can use for any given viral vaccine. Simply dump in the genetic structure of the particular vaccine that they need and then distribute it using the same base. So I don't think that there's any evidence of a patent on the virus itself as opposed to a patent on the delivery vehicle, which is the vaccine that they're now using in most of the United States and much of the West.
Yeah, so it says here the Sinovac's vaccine is a vaccine that uses an inactive, right? So it's a vector form of the COVID-19 virus instead of the mRNA technology that Pfizer and Moderna use, right? And again, I'm heavily skeptic of the mRNA technology and the rollout, and it's very uncertain. And I think that's I think it's tremendously detrimental in terms of what they're doing here and the path that they're going down with this way it's a new technology really in terms of how to deal with medicine and targeting and so forth. I mean, a lot of these companies now, from Pfizer to Moderna, they're talking about, if you have any issue, we'll just go in and genetically, fix that for you, basically. And I just don't trust it. I think there's not enough studies. It does not look good at all, right? But do you see let's talk about the Operation Warp Speed then, right? Because that was under the Trump administration. They rolled that out. And again, at least we were told that it was like, oh, this is a miracle. It's just 6 months in the process and that's it kind of thing. But again, the patent trail, if that's true, seems to indicate that that's not the case. The reason why partially they could, produce something like this at this speed was due to the fact that they had been working on this for such a long time before, right? So at least there it seems to be that the military came in and they ran this operation as a military operation. Do you think personally that the vaccine rollout ties into the COVID, the virus, and that's like a continuation of this biowarfare program? Or how do you view that?
I tend to doubt that. In other words, it's certainly possible, but I've seen no evidence of it. In other words, it's certainly true that these companies had been spending many years developing this new vaccine technology, spending a lot of money on it, and really it had no use at all until suddenly this massive epidemic appeared and they could persuade the government to fund them. Enormous amounts of money were given to all of these companies to produce a vaccine in record time because of the desperate need of the United States and the other Western European countries. So I've seen no evidence that these companies would have had any connection with the biowarfare attack I'm talking about. Again, it's a question of taking advantage of a tremendous opportunity, a tremendous crisis, using that to persuade the government to devote hundreds of billions of dollars to rolling out these vaccines in very quick time. And also, for example, bailing out all these financial firms, lowering interest rates down to zero, boosting Wall Street. I mean, all of those individuals, all of those groups have certainly benefited from the crisis. But I tend to be skeptical whether they were involved in creating the crisis by supporting the biowarfare attack against China. The other thing I should say also is that, these vaccines, despite all the original propaganda about them, they really have turned out to be much less effective by anybody's standards than had originally been promised. In other words, most of these vaccines seem to be fairly useless in preventing people from becoming infected and preventing them then from transmitting the disease to other people. What they do seem to work very well at is preventing people then from suffering severe cases of illness or dying. So in other words, the evidence I've seen is that they don't effectively deal with infection or transmission, but they do probably lower the risk of dying by a very large amount, like maybe 90% or 95%, especially for older people or people with health conditions. And so for that reason, many of these efforts to force people to be vaccinated don't seem to really make any sense to me. Because in other words, you're having a situation where you're gaining no communal benefits by getting everybody vaccinated, since they can still become infected and can still transmit the virus to other people. It's more that they themselves are less likely to become ill or, die from it. And when you're talking about a very untested virus, an untested vaccine, something that was developed using a radical new technology, I think it's perfectly reasonable to give most people the choice of either going with the risk of this untested vaccine or facing the risk of a much more severe health consequence if they do become infected. And so, I really think most of these mandates are also probably counterproductive, because when you have a lot of people who've become very suspicious of the government for all sorts of reasons, and you have the government then forcing people or pressuring people to be vaccinated using this radical new technology, I think you see now exactly this sort of almost paranoid reaction among a number of people where, we have right now, exactly. So we really have 20 or 30% of the American population that has now moved into what might be called the orbit of the anti-vaccine movement, which probably 2 or 3 years ago would have been a fraction of 1% of the population. And I see really no reason for that, especially when you're talking about vaccinating young children. All the evidence seems to be young children are almost immune to the impact of COVID. Now, It could be that there are aspects of COVID we don't know about. And it could be in the long run, it would make sense to vaccinate young children, but there's no rush for it. And, with the vaccines themselves possibly being dangerous in other ways, it seems to me a trade-off that people should make their own decision on rather than having these efforts to try to vaccinate everybody.
Oh, it's a hysterical rollout in a way we've never seen it before. The coercive, the manipulation, the propaganda, the buying of so-called influencers online to push it into smaller circles and so forth. I've never seen such a it's a coercive agenda essentially pushed so hard, right? But and we can certainly talk more about that. But back to the point you mentioned of this being also a financial, like that it's a. And of course, we do have things like, the Great Reset, and these are things that overlaps very nicely for the global elite into this as well. It's a great opportunity. You can can push all these policies. You can enforce things that you before you didn't want to do, and so forth. But just the amount of just this thing alone with people who have small businesses were forced to close, and they were considered to be non-essential, while again the big box stores and all the big chains they were allowed to remain open. It's so obvious, right? And here's just a couple of samples, but world's 10 richest men doubled their wealth during the pandemic, right? And we got some pictures of who we're talking about, that the Google people, Gates, Zuckerberg, Buffett, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and so forth, the Microsoft guy, I forget his name down there, right? Now the short hair to U.S. billionaires gained $1 trillion since the pandemic started. Change in the wealth of U.S. billionaires since the beginning of the pandemic. And this has been very beneficial to, I don't even think we can call them the 1%, the 0.00001% or something maybe. And it's clear to me that this has, the intention here has to be ruined. It's almost like we're witnessing the controlled demolition of our civilization, but using this virus as the excuse of saying we'll protect you from this. And again, you fall back to the survival rate. And as you say, sure, maybe there's a long-term effect here that we don't know about yet, and et cetera. But the point, though, is I think that there's been just massive overreach on behalf of government and health authorities and so forth to keep, we're going to keep you safe, but you have to obey. You have to do what we tell you. You have to take this new experimental gene therapy, essentially, this new technology. And you can't have your little business open. All the mom and pops, I don't even know what the tally is so far or how many have actually closed up and just how much the unemployment rate have skyrocketed. But this is a big part of it, I think. Again, it doesn't say that the people who've gained financially on this are the ones responsible, but this is one of the massive side effects of this, Ron.
Oh, I certainly agree. In other words, there are many other aspects to the crisis America is facing that certainly should be addressed. And, you could even argue that the ultimate cause of this epidemic, the fact that it probably was an American biowarfare attack against China and Iran, at this point in time, some people have told me, that doesn't matter as much. In other words, it's much less important than the case of, for example, the vaccines, than the case of all the disruption to our society, all of these control issues. And, you could make a case about that because, obviously, what's done is done. But when you're talking about a disaster of this magnitude, probably caused by America's existing biowarfare program, which had been around for 70 years, which had received $100 billion in funding, and also a disaster that was an unintentional disaster. It illustrates the tremendous danger of these weapons and why they really should be controlled. In other words, it's one thing if America were to get into a war with China or Russia in a knowing way, as we right now are, in a situation with Taiwan or with Ukraine. But when you have basically these self-replicating biological entities that can be released in one country, leak back over the border, and totally destroy all these other countries in the world, it really shows why they have to be controlled. And, if we're talking about a virus like this that inflicted this sort of damage, it really raises the question of what other viruses are in the biowarfare capabilities of the United States or other countries around the world, and why something like this has to be controlled. In other words, it seems to me when you're talking about a crisis of this magnitude, it really is useful to ask why it happened, even if the impact right now is much through the secondary issues of, the economic changes, the social changes, the technological changes, the vaccines, things like that. And, it really, it's a very negative statement about the American media also.
Yeah.
If they've been so unwilling to look at all the obvious evidence that traces the incident back to the United States and our biowarfare facilities.
And again, This is an interesting conversation here, because it doesn't matter what laws are passed or what conventions, the nations sign and so forth. And I'm showing a screenshot here of the Biological Weapons Convention, the different signatories and state parties, right? And it's 183 state parties, including Palestine, and 4 signatories, blah, 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 that are included in this. But the point is, when you have whether it's a small rogue element within, a military or something doing something like this, the point is, you can pass any laws you want. These are people that are breaking those laws, right? And again, I think now as well, this is actually a lesson. Now, if it's true that the picture you've painted here, let's assume that is the correct version. That's the truth. That's what happened, and so forth. That gives us a warning about where we're going in the future, because as new technologies, as new gene editing and sequencing, and as it becomes available, we are looking at a situation where a very small handful of people can eradicate billions of people potentially with these programs. As they continue to edit and they continue to do gain-of-function research, making it more transmissible to humans, they're making it more deadly. Now, you have a kind of, as far as I understand that situation, a trade-off, if you will, that the deadlier a pathogen is, a virus, the less likely it is to spread, because usually you die before you can spread it to others, right? That's part of why the Ebola virus and Marburg and so forth haven't, they end up dying essentially before they can infect others. It would be, again, maybe here's where gene editing would come in, Ron, that they actually managed to genetically alter an existing virus to such a degree, like Ebola or Marburg, that you have asymptomatic spread or something, that people actually carry it, and they have it for weeks or months on end before they start showing symptoms, and that would actually be a catastrophic, deadly event. So what do we do about something? Maybe this isn't what you've been thinking about, but I want to ask you anyway. What do we do about these kinds of programs? There has to be we shouldn't be experimenting on it at all to begin with, right? What do you think?
I think at the very least, if the scenario I'm painting is correct, it illustrates the tremendously dangerous nature of biowarfare programs, and why, it really is a foolish idea for countries to even develop them as a possible use, because, if you use it, basically even under the best of circumstances, it can spread back and destroy your own country. The other thing also I think this raises is the question of our media, because so much of what we know about all of these issues comes through the filter of the media. And to the extent that the media has totally ignored all of this evidence, all of these important issues, if it really does become clear that these facts are as strong as I think they probably are, it really would raise all sorts of issues of all the other things the media is covering up. And, the media is basically the way we know about the outside world. And if the media could cover up something of this tremendous magnitude that has probably killed 20 million people around the world already, it really shows that the media should, be viewed in a very different light. And so, I think probably the impact, it's a little bit like, for example, the Chernobyl disaster. It only killed, I think, a relatively small number of people in Ukraine, but it contaminated parts of Europe. It was a disaster and it basically changed people's views of the nature of nuclear reactors, and that they should be treated in a very different way. Same thing with the Fukushima disaster. Where the reactor almost went critical. If a release of a bioweapon developed by the American government unintentionally at the top of the American government has caused, this devastation in our own country and that of all of our allies, as well as the rest of the world. It really shows that Richard Nixon was entirely right back in, I think it was 1970 or 1971, when he signed the treaty outlawing bioweapon development, which then we repudiated after the fall of the Soviet Union.
And the point, though, here, too, is that might not help. We're now approaching the level of technology where allegedly, and I remember reading the articles, I'm looking for them. There's a couple I'm pulling up here, but basically with very simple methods, there are now dedicated parties that can develop these things in their kitchen, in their basement, if you will. We're not quite there yet, but that's where the technology is taking and leading us, which means that if you have a handful of very dedicated people, they could cause tremendous damage. And at least at this point, there really isn't any way to protect yourself against that. Unfortunately, and I'm not saying I'm arguing for this or whatever, but it would be like, Yeah, if you had a ubiquitous surveillance at all time or something, that would, that's something, and I'm sure that's will be used as an excuse to bring in, a ubiquitous Big Brother state as well, and we're already kind of approaching that. But and again, the coronavirus have been used in that capacity, with all the tracing apps, for example, on people's phones, right? Then the next step here is vaccine passports, and then that will be tied to your social credit score. And if you don't, essentially, if you're a dissident, which of course you're very, very aware of how many people these days are targeted just for their opinions. If you don't bow down to new health measures, for example, you won't be able to enter a certain establishment. You might not even in the future be able to enter a grocery store unless you've been vaccinated. I think today, actually, Austria passed their law where they're beginning to criminalize the purebloods, the vaccine, those who have chosen to be vaccine-free. And I believe it's going to start with a fine if you don't comply, but eventually that will lead to prison time. That's insane to me, but that's where things are going, Ron.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, there are an awful lot of other issues associated with this that we'll have to face moving forward. But it seems to me, at the very least, I mean, these gain-of-function experiments and so many billions of dollars that America has spent developing these dangerous viruses, developing these bioweapons over the last 20 or 30 years, ended up being a total disaster for our own country and for our allies. So, it seems to me it would be very reasonable to have a global agreement cracking down on developing any bioweapons along these lines, whether, allegedly for defensive or offensive purposes. And, other than that, I mean, to the extent that the technologies continue to develop to the point where small groups of people could produce these deadly illnesses and release them on the world, I don't really have any particular answers to that.
I know it's very hard. It's incredibly hard. We're entering into a brave new world, to use that analogy. Sure. And it's very dangerous. Technology overall is heading in a direction where we're not quite sure where this will take us. It's moving so fast that if you look back genetically and how we developed and so forth, we haven't. We have never had things move this fast around us, and usually it takes a long time for us to adapt to new environments. At least for the most part, I think adapt to new environments and new circumstances. And now I think we're living in a completely new world, and a lot of people consequently can't deal with that. Just look at social media, the impact that's having, the depression rates, and the addiction now that people are getting to their digital devices and things, right? So that's just that's part of it. But what else do you think we should mention here? And again, I think there's a lot more we could talk about, when it comes to the vaccine rollout. But I know as well, it's not kind of your, in a way, your wheelhouse. You haven't really focused that much on that aspect. You've been looking at, as you said, and this is what you cover on the website. And I encourage people to go there and look at the articles that you've written about this. And I guess they're all kind of housed under the American Pravda series. Is that where people can go to find them? Yeah.
There's actually a section dealing with biowarfare or the COVID outbreak, focused on exactly these articles. And, it's a series I've been writing now since basically April 2020, it's probably about 80,000 words. It's been viewed a few 100,000 times over the internet. And it seems to me the key thing is simply, once some of these issues, in terms of the secret American government report, in terms of the fact that Iran specifically accused America of launching a biowarfare attack against it after it suddenly became the center of the COVID outbreak right after Wuhan, China. Once those facts get out there, I think it would become very difficult for the media to cover them up and to ignore them. And it seems to me, if 1 million Americans have died over what was probably a reckless rogue operation by elements of the American government, I think the American people deserve to know that. And if it was a consequence of the $100 billion America had spent over 50 or 60 years developing these deadly biowarfare weapons, then I think the American people should know that as well. And the only way you can solve a problem is to know at least what was behind it. Yeah. And, the evidence, I think, is so strong that, one reason I think the media doesn't cover it is because simply putting these facts out there would, I think, convince an awful lot of people that that's probably exactly what happened.
Yeah, precisely. Do you think that we will get some accountability? This is very hard to know. This is in prediction territory, which is always very hard. But it stands to reason that there would be enough interest. But also, when we do have investigations, we don't always get sincere ones. Obviously, we get false ones. We get politically motivated ones, and so forth. And it seems even harder these days to. Everything is almost immediately drawn up along partisan lines. And then you kind of pick one or the other side, and again, then you lose that kind of objectivity that would be necessary in a situation like this to actually get to the root of something. But do you think we'll get accountability? What do you think is next here? I mean, do you think this will just keep circulating and mutating, or will we control it at some point? What's your sense of it?
It's hard to say. I mean, I'm not an expert in microbiology. So in other words, the fact that it looks like the Omicron version that's now going around is both extremely infectious and also relatively mild. So one of the key questions is, once people become infected with Omicron, are they then immune, and for how long, to all the other much more dangerous versions of the virus? And will there be another version of the virus that might come out in the future? And I really don't have any particular ideas on that. But, the question of whether the facts of what happened, and they cover it up, I mean, it seems to me very difficult. I mean, we're talking about something that, it's been less than 2 years since the outbreak of the virus. The first couple of books have now come out arguing about the origins of the virus, covered in the Wall Street Journal, covered in other sources. I think once people start looking into it and digging into it, a lot of the facts I've mentioned will become much more widely known. And, it's very difficult to bottle them up afterwards. So I think probably in a relatively short period of time, the truth will start to come out.
Do you think there could be retaliatory measures taken? Let's assume that China did figure this out, or maybe they already, the accusations were there and they've said this now. So, but I'm saying definitively, and maybe they don't know the who yet, but they know that it was done to them. They have enough evidence of that.
Sure.
Retaliation, and I mean, again, it would also maybe embolden even the people that releases from the beginning and say, let's do another one in Iran, and let's do it even deadlier this time or something.
Well, I mean, again, under my reconstruction, it ended up being an unintentional blowback scenario and an utter disaster from the point of view of the small handful of people in the American government who launched the attack. China survived almost unscathed. America was devastated. America's allies were devastated. 1 million Americans died. So, first of all, there would be no way for the Chinese to prove what happened. In other words, they could strongly suspect what happened using exactly the same sort of reasoning that I've pointed out, these facts, but they wouldn't have proof. They also wouldn't have proof on who was involved. America would obviously be the most likely suspect, but simply one suspect. But stepping back a little bit, I mean, I from the beginning, I thought it very unlikely that the Chinese would retaliate in any way, because basically they escaped with only a few thousand dead. They reacted very quickly. Their economy and society suffered very little damage at all, while America was devastated. I mean, basically, large fraction of the American population ended up spending almost 2 years, in effect, locked down. I mean, our society has been tremendously disrupted, and 1 million Americans died. So, it's the sort of thing. The analogy would be if you basically launch an arson attack against your next door neighbor that you're feuding with, he puts out the fire. His home escapes almost unscathed, but the fire spreads back to your own home and burns it to the ground. I mean, the idea of him retaliating against you probably wouldn't make much sense. So, right now we're obviously in a confrontation with China. We're in a confrontation with Russia. But the confrontation is over Taiwan and Ukraine rather than their suspicions that we'd attack them with a biowarfare technology. And I think basically what probably would happen if word got out is there might finally be, I guess, what might be called the fall of the American regime. In other words, if people started believing that 1 million Americans had died, that our country had been locked down for 2 years because of an unbelievably reckless biowarfare attack against another country by members near the top of the American government, that might be finally something that would be able to wake up the American people and make them realize that we had to change the way we were running things.
Yeah, we have the Beijing Olympics coming up here now too. I forget when the starting date is, but I do know that they've been very hard again. There's some areas where they're supposedly locking down again in China, right? Because this is what we've gotten. I remember back in September, it was like, oh, Denmark and Norway, they're opening up again, they're freeing up, and then literally 3 to 4 weeks later, no, that's back. We're back in lockdown, right? So it's this extremely demoralizing aspect to the population, which I personally think that's quite intentional. But Sweden was one of the latest countries now as well to release the restrictions. They did say, though, there's a caveat to that where some people that are not vaccinated, there's some specific precaution around them that needs to be taken. So we'll see what that remains to be because there's kind of this two-tier society that's developing. But let's assume that they do release it now or release the restrictions, then you would anything could happen tomorrow. Well, they say, oh, here's a new variant, and now it's even deadlier or something. And then, it's back into lockdown, and this will just be like a never-ending cycle that just drains people morale completely.
Oh, I agree with you. In other words, the way to think about it is what the West now has experienced is probably exactly what the group of hypothetical conspirators I'm talking about had expected would happen in China. They would have expected tremendous social disruption, large numbers of deaths, devastation to the economy, and, possibly the fall of the regime. And if it were basically the unintentional blowback of the American government, elements of the American national security establishment that inflicted this gigantic disaster in American society, I think we really would see the fall of the American regime. And given the things that have been going on over the last 15 or 20 years, especially September 11th, I think that really would be a very necessary step for us to take.
Yes, I agree. Well, this has certainly been interesting. It's a different take on things than we've been discussing. And of course, that's what I appreciate. I like hearing different views and different takes on this. There certainly are a lot of them and different takes out there as well. But for people that want to check out your material on this, the American Pravda series, and of course, on that page, you have a link directly to this. Just search for or look for major COVID/biowarfare articles. And there you have a little bit further down the page, all the main articles that you've written in the series as well. And some of it I want to go through more in detail myself. We're gonna wrap up here shortly. I'm going to let you go. But this is certainly a discussion that could continue. I'd love to have you back again at some point in the future, but there's other ins and outs of this that would be interested in talking about and testing the theory, so to speak. But no, Ron, I appreciate your time. It's good to have you here. Thank you for reaching out and wanting to talk about that. Just tell us a bit more about On's Review, how people can, if they can, support your work in some way, and what you have coming up on the website and so forth.
Sure. Well, we're basically an alternative media webzine. We syndicate a number of writers from the left, from the right, libertarian, other perspectives. We have a number of writers who are basically on our staff, bloggers or columnists who write for us. And, I've also written quite a lot of stuff myself, which, as I said, the American Pravda series is the most comprehensive thing that I've put together. It's about probably by now 3 or 4 dozen articles focused on issues of what might be called conspiracy theories, the Second World War, the First World War, more recent developments in the country. It's basically grouped into a number of different areas, with the central theme, and that's the reason it's called American Pravda, being that so much of what we're informed by our media, by the mainstream history textbooks, is really untrue. And the only way we can cope with the things in our world is if we focus on what really happened then and what's really happening today, and deal with it that way rather than deal with the phantoms that are projected by media outlets or by history textbooks and that sort of thing. And obviously, when we're talking about something like this right now, the COVID outbreak, with as many as 20 million people having died around the world, devastation and disruption in the United States, an event of this magnitude, to the extent that the media and even much of the alternative media, I feel, has been avoiding the obvious issue of what probably happened, or at least might have happened. That seems to be something that has to be reversed before we can hope to even address any of these other issues. So, it's basically, the way to look at it is, if you stop really believing what you read in the textbooks, and if you stop believing what you read in the daily newspapers or the mainstream media, it's important to start trying to form a coherent perspective of what really happened at different points in time and major events. And that's what I've tried to do myself and what a lot of the writers on the website do. So, it's the sort of thing we publish probably about probably maybe 15 or 20 blog posts a day, columns and blog posts a day. We have a number of writers. We have a tremendously large archive system. And in fact, as I mentioned, I think I'd spent the early 2000s building a huge archiving system containing the complete archives of many of the leading periodicals and opinion magazines in America for the last 150 years. And people can dig through those to find out what they viewed of the world back when it was happening, rather than what the history textbooks now say. So, it's basically a website designed to sort of present all these alternative ideas to people and let people decide for themselves.
No, I appreciate it. I think there's some great columnists that you call their home on On's Review. There's a lot of great range, true, as I said in the opening, true diversity actually of thought and opinion. We don't have that to use actually the positive aspects of that word, but no, but it's very good. Big range. I'm sure most of our audience is familiar with it, but if not, check it out. It's uns.com, the Uns Review. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate your time and your perspective today. And as I said, I'd love to have you back, and maybe we can go into some other avenues next time. There's certainly a lot of other things we could talk about here today, but I appreciate your time.
Hey, great to be here.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it. All right, there we go. We're going to wrap up right there. Thank you, Ron, for joining us. I appreciate that. What we'll do is we'll just say bye to you guys, and I think that it's going to be very interesting to. I want to read some more of Ron's stuff as well. Some of his other articles. I've gone through some of it, but not all of it. And again, these are good to get a different take on some of this. I think he's largely correct in the sense we've been stuck between two different versions of this, right? We have two different strains essentially that we've been allowed to discuss. There's maybe 3, 4, 5 different takes out there, different aspects of what actually is going on, and I think Ron at least represents one of those, as opposed to just the two that we get back and forth between the. To boil it down, it's the progressive left in the mainstream media that has one version. Granted, it keeps shifting, and then you have kind of the conservative, kind of in a way, at least from the American perspective, kind of the pro-Trump that faction. That's they're the lab leak theory. It's all China, kind of thing. And I think Ron could be right there that we're stuck between that and not looking, kind of for a third way, if you will. Okay. So, guys, I appreciate you joining us today. So it was good to have you here. We're going to wrap up there. We're going to be back tomorrow with Flashback Friday. Let me check Odyssey real quick here. And it's hard, sometimes when you interview, it's harder to keep an eye on the chat. I do admit, because you're thinking of the next question. Let me check Odyssey real quick, and then do Entropy as well. What do we have? Vegan Videos over on Entropy says. Sorry, I don't think this is heading in the right direction. I'm no longer hearing anything about the virus not existing at all. And I haven't once heard the J word. Yeah, it's clear that Ron wouldn't be, I guess, effective in a discussion whether it exists or not. I think it's better to just bring someone on, and I know I've said it. This could be a good follow-up, I guess, since we've had Ron Anzon talking about this. Either Kaufman, I think, would be good, but I also would like to get... Cowan on. Is it Tom Cowan? Thomas Cowan? He's done some really interesting work, and I know that they both collaborate and stuff like that, so maybe both of them would come on. But no, I agree. That's something we definitely need to cover and bring on as well. And that door is wide open for me. I haven't closed my door on any of these theories. That's just how it goes. Thank you, Vegan Videos. I appreciate it. But yeah, maybe... I'm not even sure if it would be a debate would be good. I think it's better what I saw with Andrew Kaufman debating, what was her name again? The pandemic gal? I forget her name. Maybe Chad has it. That was a good kind of discussion, because she's like in that sphere in terms of like biochemistry and stuff like that, right? So that would be a good discussion, right? Not sure if Ron Ons would be strong in debating someone like Andrew Kaufman or something like that. But anyway, Night Train over, and I think this might actually have been from yesterday. I apologize for missing that over on Odyssey. But real quick here before we round off, Night Train 88 said, non-vax kept my job. My hill to die on has been claimed. No more brother war. I love you guys. Morale and passive measure of resistance. Keep yours up and be proudly European, and we shall never be defeated. Love, long live, I think you should say. I think it was autocorrected that. Long live our people and our future. Thank you, Nitro, and I appreciate that. I do apologize for missing that yesterday. But yeah, guys, so we'll be back tomorrow with Flashback Friday. We're going to have Raging Dissident as a guest host tomorrow. I'm still looking at trying to get a second guy on from Canada there as well. I need to reach out to him here today right away and see if he can come on. He was in Ottawa. He's taken some of the videos there. And I know things are unfolding today, so it's been hard to cover this because of our interview with Ron today. But apparently the latest is that the Canadian, the RCMP is basically sending in reinforcement now, especially at the blockade in Cuts in Alberta. And they're going to, they've been blocking the border right there between Montana and Alberta, the U.S. and Canada. And they're sending in reinforcement. And as I kind of, talked about yesterday, I think they're going to do a massive overreach. But it remains to be seen. I think it's going to be cracked. That's going to reveal itself rather over maybe it has today already by while we've done this interview. But definitely by tomorrow we'll have some more answers in terms of what their next move is going to be. Because they're not going to let this go. The cops are basically declared like that's it. We're done. This is illegal, so we're going to kind of clamp down on this. So it could turn ugly really, really fast. So I think tomorrow will be a good day to follow up on the situation in Canada. But otherwise, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us. We will be back with more tomorrow. Until then, stay unvaxxed, and of course, as always, keep questioning all of it. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.
Do you love Red Ice? Want more? Get access to exclusive material by signing up for a Red Ice membership. You'll be able to watch Weekend Warrior, our flagship show, the second hour of interviews, and other special feature videos only for subscribers. Were you a member and we lost you along the way? Renew! We love and appreciate you guys and gals and cannot do this without you. Help us be a sane voice, a lighthouse in the sea of insanity. As times get tougher, as people are searching for answers, they're going to need content like Red Ice. A little of all your support can go a long way. Thank you.